Let's face it, flashcard fans have had it real good over the past few years with loads of different options appearing on their favorite cartridge-based systems. These accessories have become essential for people who prefer to play 8 and 16-bit games on original hardware, but are interested in expanding their horizons when it comes to games on each console, or simply avoiding wear and tear on their game collection. As we move to the 32-bit generation and beyond, achieving this becomes exponentially more complex. Sure, the disc-based media that most systems use from here on out opened up nearly limitless possibilities. But moving parts like motors and gears and drives, as well as the more fragile nature of discs themselves, came as a compromise. In recent years, we've really begun to see the proliferation of optical disc emulators, or ODE for short, on classic CD-ROM-based consoles. These devices provide a way to play disc-based games off of solid-state media, such as an SD card. Let's check out the TerraOnion mode, one such device that can replace the disk drive in your Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, and most recently, Sony PlayStation. Flash cartridges have become real popular in recent years as a method of playing older games, hacks, and homebrew without software emulation. To achieve the same goal with systems that use CDs and other disc-based media has proven to be a much bigger hurdle. The idea behind optical disc emulators isn't exactly a new one, but it's much less mature in the world of video games. Don't let the name confuse you. The overarching idea of an ODE is that it serves as a replacement of the optical drive, so the hardware otherwise still functions as normal. I covered the Rhea and Phoebe in a previous episode, which did exactly this on the Sega Saturn. But in the years since, the rules of what defined an ODE began to blur. TerraOnion themselves incorporated different methods of utilizing ODE tech with the Super SD System 3 for the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16, and the Mega SD for the Sega Genesis. These were plug-and-play alternatives for their CD-ROM add-ons. While the SSDS3 had a bit of a bumpy road at first because it needed to also provide video outputs, the Mega SD was a revelation and really became a must-have accessory for fans of the Sega and Mega CD. 32-bit and beyond is a different beast though. The Rhea and Phoebe for the Sega Saturn and the GDEMU for the Dreamcast were among the first of their kind on the scene for their respective platforms. Unfortunately, and much to the dismay of fans lining up to purchase these mods, they became frustratingly hard to get as word of mouth of their usefulness began to spread. Before long, no-name clone versions of the GDEMU began to flood the market. But to many surprise, the Rhea and Phoebe ODEs remained uncloned for whatever reason. Faced with a hungry market, a number of developers set to creating their own alternatives. Professor Abrasive made enormous waves when he discovered how to circumvent the Saturn's security, which led to the development of the Sadiator, a plug-and-play solution that inserts into the MPEG cart slot on the back of the console, and can load games off an SD card. And then you have the Fenrir, which was revealed in early December 2019 by developer SED. The Fenrir's low cost of entry and generally simple installation made it an easy choice for those interested in a Saturn ODE, despite some early console compatibility challenges. In April of 2020, TerraOnion, riding high in the success of the Mega SD, revealed Mode, an FPGA-based optical disc emulator that will work in all variants of Sega Saturn hardware and supports microSD, flash, and typical SATA drives, solid-state and mechanical. However, the most appealing idea behind the Mode is tied to the M in its name. Mode stands for Multi-Optical Disc Emulator. The premise being that it's able to automatically detect what system it's plugged into and load a dedicated interface for that system. When it made its way into consumer hands in July of 2020, the Mode supported both the Sega Saturn and the Sega Dreamcast. Although it retails for around $230 US, the ability to use it in two different consoles helped in justifying the cost. TerraOnion provided us with a Mode review unit for the purpose of covering in this video. Installing the Mode in both systems is fairly simple. You'll need to open up the system and remove the old disk drive. So yes, it is plug and play, but there is some legwork required. At least there's no soldering involved, if that sort of thing makes you nervous. Although enabling some of the optional features do need it. With the Saturn, you need to remove the 4 pegs that suspend the CD-ROM drive, and that requires taking off the heat shield. You also need to pinch a power cable for the mode itself in between the pins of the power supply. Honestly, this is a bit harder than it sounds, and took me longer than anything else during my initial installation. Since then, Mobius Strip Tech has released a power harness that fits on the pins before the power supply slips on, making the whole thing way less of a hassle. The mode works for both 20 and 21 pin Saturns. For the uninitiated, this relates to the ribbon that is connected to the CD-ROM drive. Most Model 1 systems, aka the ones with the oval power and reset buttons, used 20-pin connectors. Model 2s had circular power and reset buttons and used 21-pin connectors. Comparatively, the Dreamcast installation is significantly more straightforward. Once you remove the original GD-ROM drive, the connector on the underside of the mode will fit right into the now vacant port which passes data and supplies power. In addition, the mode will only work on VA0 and VA1 model Dreamcast consoles. This info is located on the bottom of the console, next to the region. No matter what system you're installing in, you'll want to use the included plastic feet that snap into the 4 holes on the PCB. These ensure that the mode is at the correct height to avoid additional strain on the connectors. These feet have an optional sticky tape adhesive on them to prevent sliding around, but it's not completely necessary. I personally only mounted 2 feet in each console and left the other 2 on the device itself. The surface of the mode has a number of ports and buttons. In addition to the previously mentioned ribbon ports and power connectors, you have the SATA, USB, and microSD slot for your storage options. However, keep in mind that the positioning of the USB and SATA ports prevent you from having both occupied at the same time. There's a couple of buttons that are used to swap disks and reset to the menu, as well as an expansion port that is currently reserved for future use. The JST9 expansion connector port can be used to enable additional functionality such as region and access LED blinking. I got the most use out of this port by connecting it to my DC Digital HDMI mod, which lets you reset back to the mode's menu or do a disk swap directly from within the DC Digital's interface. Whether or not this is worth the extra effort is up to you, as you'll need to purchase a harness that is sold separately and have some soldering skills. For years, the PSIO had a corner on the PlayStation 1 market when it came to ODEs. In 2020, renewed competition came in the form of the X Station from Rama. Shortly after, in October of 2020, PS1 support also arrived on the mode, bringing the total number of systems supported to 3. However, there's a couple of very important caveats to consider when it comes to all PS1 ODEs. First, they only work on specific models of the console. In the case of the mode, it'll only work on a system with a PU18 motherboard, which are primarily only in Model 5500 consoles, although select 7000 models have also been known to have it. Secondly, is due to the PS1's copy protection security, it's not possible for any ODE mod to be plug and play. You'll need to solder a mod chip, or in this case, a PCB on the underside of the motherboard. After that, you have to lift some pins on the CXD2545Q chip. This is where things get pretty hairy. It might not be difficult for seasoned modders, but this will absolutely put ODE support for PS1 fans out of reach if you have no experience with this kind of stuff. A couple of minor shell-related mods are also needed to make sure that the mode fits in the system nicely. Finally, a plastic shield sits over the board to protect it. Compared to the Saturn and Dreamcast installations, I have to admit that the way that the mode sits inside of the PS1 isn't exactly the most elegant thing. I couldn't even put the top on without an insanely thin 2.5-inch hard drive. If you're set on putting the mode in a PS1 and you meet all the requirements, Mobius Strip Tech sells the kit, which includes all the needed parts and PCBs, for around $20. The kit is also expected to be offered by StoneAgeGamer in the future. If the removal of the disk drives in any of these consoles strikes you as looking a bit unsightly, definitely check out Laser Bear Industries, who designs and sells an array of 3D printed modules for a much more flush look. And they also make it much easier to hit those surface-mounted buttons. Alright, close up your system and you're good to go. Although you might want to hold off on using the screws to completely seal the system right now. Whether it be moving the mode between different consoles or adding games to the variety of drives, you'll find yourself taking off the top a whole bunch while you get all the games situated in the way that you like them. The mode supports a variety of file types across different consoles. .bin and Q and .iso are the most typical disk images you'll come across when it comes to CD-based games, although you might also run into .cdi, .ccd, and .mdf here and there. Dreamcast games are often seen as .gdi files, but you might also come across them as .cdi images. These versions have been compressed or had dummy data removed to shrink them down so they can fit on a CDR. You should format your storage to either FAT32 or exFAT. At the root, make a folder for each system you're planning to use it with. Each system will only see the files within its respective directory. Saturn for Saturn, Dreamcast for Dreamcast, and PSX for PlayStation. From there, you're welcome to organize files and directories as you see fit, as long as each game goes in its own folder. The modes menu is handled at the firmware level, and all three are contained within one file. When booting a system, it'll detect what console it's attached to and boot the correct interface. For anyone who's been on the fence of choosing between the mode and one of the other devices that have roughly the same basic functionality, the modes menu navigation is one of the two main features that I feel really makes it stand out against the competition. The menu itself is displayed at 240p on the PlayStation 1, 480i on the Saturn, and either 480i or 480p on the Dreamcast. There was a point where I hoped for a 240p display option for the Saturn, but realistically, games on the system switch between video modes so frequently that it wouldn't make much of a difference. Besides, now that I've seen the PS1's 240p menu, it's just way too blurry. I think that certain aspects would need to be overhauled completely, such as the font, for it to work. I'm guessing that the main reason for the forced 480i is likely the cover art list option for the Saturn and Dreamcast, but it's yet to come to the PlayStation 1. To use the covers, you have to download a database file from TerraOnion's website and place it on the SD card. The covers definitely give more personality to your digital game collection, but they tend to load so slowly on the Saturn that it's tough to say if it's worth using. Thankfully, the Dreamcast loads these images so much faster. I understand that it's playing the games is the most important, but I'm big on sorting my games into various subdirectories to keep them organized. And as of right now, that's something that most of the competition is lacking. However, firmware management and updates brings us to one of the more divisive aspects of not only the mode, but all of TerraOnion's products. It's tied to a serial number, so you'll need to go to TerraOnion's website, create an account, and register the device to download future updates, which will only install if it has a matching serial number. Along with the menu, support for multiple storage devices is the mode's other killer feature. Using a hard drive or SSD has the potential to give you enough space to hold each system's entire game library if you wanted to be especially gluttonous. If you're using a micro SD card at the same time, these do not show up in one consolidated list. You have to switch between each storage with a press of a button. I personally really like this approach because I like to put all the game images I ripped myself onto the SD card, while using the larger storage for other stuff, like hacks, fan translations, and more. And what is probably my biggest complaint? I wish that there's just a way to transfer games between storage within the mode interface. This would eliminate the need to open up the system, take out the SSD, and add files to it. I'd much prefer to copy new stuff to the micro SD, boot up the system, and then transfer it to the SSD that way. However, I've heard that this functionality is in the works for a future firmware update, so here's hoping that it arrives relatively soon. Accessing the modes menu brings up a ton of different options that vary from system to system. For the most part, these are made up of video output choices, system reset behaviors, and region selection options. You might find the selection to be a bit more sparse on the PlayStation 1, but that could be because the compatibility is still fairly new right now. However, note that some of these require specific mods and then need to be connected to the JST9 harness to work. The region patching will automatically apply a patch to let you play games from other regions than the system is from. It's just best to leave this on. The option isn't present on the PS1 because the additional mod board that was applied during installation also functions as a mod chip. Reset input behavior and reset output signal determine how a system behaves when you reset a game either via an in-game shortcut or via the physical button on the system. Soft reset to menu will take you back to the mode menu instead of the BIOS menu when you use a system's native reset button combo. Normally, if you were to open the disk lid when playing a game, you'd likely get an error or get kicked out back to the system's BIOS screen. The disable lid switch toggle prevents this, and is especially important if you plan on keeping your system half naked, so it's easier to move the mode between consoles or swap out storage devices. Fast boot skips the system's boot up animation once you select a game to start. Supposedly, this can cause the game not to boot properly from time to time, but I've personally never run into this issue. If a game doesn't seem to be running right and you have this option enabled, try turning it off and see if that fixes it. On the Dreamcast, Auto VGA patch does not require a mod and will patch a game for 480p output, even if the game doesn't support it. Of course, there are some notable exceptions where this won't work, such as with Hydro Thunder. GD-ROM seek speed is meant to improve compatibility with problematic disk images, while GD-ROM read speed can enhance load times, but the overall benefits of this can vary from game to game. Other systems don't have an equivalent option. Perhaps it's a hardware limitation, but I think it's fair to say that you can expect at least subtly faster load times for most games. I suppose the last thing that needs to be addressed when it comes to the menu is how multi-disc games are handled. When sorting games on your storage, you should put all the discs for one game into the same folder. When selecting that game, it'll place all the discs in a queue, and you can choose what disc to boot up. When a game reaches their natural disc swap point while you're playing, open the lid, hit the switch on the mode board, and this will load the next disc in the queue. I gotta say, I really like how this is handled. It makes sense. It's just quick and easy. So, is that it? Well, in terms of basic functionality, yeah, I suppose it is. But one of the most enticing aspects of a flash cart is the additional feats that they can perform that lie outside of the realm of what plain old original hardware can do. Is an ODE capable of the same kind of benefits? Well, in some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. Let's take a look at some of the cool things you should check out if you find yourself with a mode or equivalent ODE. I think it's fair to say that one of the biggest draws of a device like a flash cart or an ODE is the ability to play fan translations and hacks. Of course, disc-based games are significantly larger in size than cartridges, so there's definitely a bit more work involved for those who want to create these. In recent years, the release schedule of hacks and translations has increased from a trickle to a pour, with some super cool things having popped up in the last year alone. In the late 90s, Grandia on the Saturn was one of those Japanese exclusive RPGs that I was just dying to play. For years, rumors swirled of working designs doing a localization, but a falling out with Sega put an end to that. In 1999, it showed up on the Sony PlayStation, and by the end of the year, we had it in English, at last. It's well known that a number of compromises were made to put the game on the PS1, but it was good enough. The translation is pretty decent. I even have a soft spot for the, not great voice acting.
Don't worry. A punch like that? Nothing to it.
Thanks to Trekkies Unite 118, we can finally enjoy the best of both worlds. The Saturn version of Grandia with the PlayStation 1 translation, and it is awesome. In much the same vein, we have Lunar the Silver Star, which takes the Working Designs English localization from the PlayStation 1 version and transplants it into the Sega Saturn game. There's also an MPEG card version in the works for those who have that accessory, which will allow for enhanced FMVs. It still has some bugs that need to be squashed, but it's coming along nicely. Thanks to Trekkies Unite 118, Mr. Conan, Ms. T, and everyone who's been working hard on this project. It's one of my favorite games of all time.
La, 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 la.
For a system with such a short lifespan, it's pretty amazing just how many weird Dreamcast games had English localizations. Of course, there were plenty that didn't. Thanks to a translation by Kargaden, we can finally experience Nappletail, Arcia, and Daydream. This curious 3D platformer features compelling characters like a frog in a car, and has an insane amount of text. Shenmue is likely the most iconic game on the Dreamcast, but plenty will say that the stilted English voice acting brings the overall experience down. For those people, we have the Shenmue Undub, which restores the original voiceovers. Just don't forget to switch your settings to game mode so that you have subtitles. Don't worry, the PlayStation isn't missing out on the action. I mentioned the Tales of Fantasia translation from Fantasian Productions in a previous video, which is still great to check out. But how about the translation of Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere from Team Nemo? The US release of this had all sorts of content removed, such as the entire storyline, cutscenes, and even some missions, all of which amounted to an entire disc worth of stuff. Now, you can play it as it was truly meant to be played. Brave Prove is one of those games that probably would have been considered a cult classic if it was localized back in 1998, but I suppose we'll have to settle for this fan translation. This overhead action RPG feels like an evolution of the late 16-bit gen greats like TerraOnion, with nice looking sprites and a soaring overworld theme. Of course, no mention of fan translations would be complete without the impeccable translation of Police Knots, the long sought after follow-up to Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. This graphical point-and-click adventure spans 3 discs and has all the quirks, plot twists, and detailed explanations for the most trivial things that we love about any Kojima game. This translation also exists for the PlayStation 1 version of the game. If you're looking for one translation to play on your ODE, this is the one. Check out policeknots.net for more info.
そう。私よ、ジョナサン。28年ぶりね。
今頃どうして?
On the hacks and homebrew side of things, there might not be as wide of a range of random stuff as there is with cartridges, but there's still some fun things and useful hacks you should check out that might just pique your interest. Senile Team's Beats of Rage compilations for the Dreamcast is a rousing, ridiculous series of brawlers that use sprite rips and gameplay enhancements from a bunch of different games to make something that is much better than these sorts of things usually tend to be. You've got mashups of King of Fighters, SNK vs. Capcom, Double Dragon, Streets of Rage. There's even this silly Road Rash brawler where you throw bikes and their motorcycles across the screen as if they were a ragdoll. Usually I tend to hate these Mugen type games, but this one is 100% more fun than you think it is. Some of the more interesting hacks coming out for the Saturn are those that incorporate Capcom's 4 meg RAM enhancement cart, which have been created by YZB. Castlemania Symphony of the Night was the first such hack to appear, which speeds up loading, smooths out animations, and has a bunch of quality of life tweaks to the controls. Although it can't solve all the slowdown issues, it does a pretty good job of making it much more playable. Since this release, there have been 4 meg enhanced versions of King of Fighters 95 and 96, and Ultraman. Although, I couldn't get that one to run correctly. It would just sit on the loading screen. If you have a RAM cart, try these out for sure, and hopefully you'll have better luck with Ultraman than I did. I love me some light gun games, but there's several for the PS1 that I've never had the chance to play because I don't have one of Konami's Justifier guns for the system. I just have Namco's GunCon. If you're in the same situation, well, you're in luck. There's a set of patches that takes 3 light gun games, Crypt Killer, Die Hard Trilogy, and Lethal Enforcers 1 and 2, and makes them work with the, let's face it, vastly superior light gun. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know how I can get about backing up and preserving save files. For years, there's been plenty of options for doing this with cartridges, many of which I covered in its own episode. But systems that used internal RAM required a bit of work, and the Saturn was especially challenging in this regard. I've experimented with a device called the Saturn Data Link that used the I/O port on the top of an action replay card. Although it could only dump and restore the complete contents of your internal backup RAM at one time, it worked decently. With the most recent firmware update, this exact ability was added to the mode's main menu, which is huge for backing up those especially easy to lose save files. But thanks to a programmer named Slinga, we now have a mode version of the Save Game Copier, which allows you to dump and restore individual save files from both the internal save RAM and a backup RAM cart using the mode's SD card. The same files can then be stored away on your PC for safekeeping or sharing with others. there's a disk image for your mode that you can download alongside your firmware files on TerraOnion's website. But I recommend grabbing the newest version from Slinga's GitHub instead, because several new updates have appeared since the initial release. It's still a bit finicky and can be a little bit slow sometimes, but that is a relatively small hassle for people who care about this kind of stuff, like myself. Of course, I've saved the most exciting for last. Dreamcast fans were shocked when the developer named Megavolt85 dropped a link on the Dreamcast Talk forums to a port of Metal Slug 6. The catch being that this was a port of the Atomus Wave arcade hardware version, whose hardware shares a lot of similarities to the Dreamcast. These games never appeared on the DC because it was already dead by the time it debuted in the arcades. Thanks to the added benefits of an ODE like the mode, Metal Slug 6 and other games that were locked to that platform are now playable on the Dreamcast hardware. Since October of 2020, Megavolt85 has cranked out ports to at least 20 Atomus Wave games. There's so much good stuff here to explore, especially for fighting game fans.
The time of retribution. Battle 1. Decide the destiny.
The Fists of the North Star one-on-one fighting game has some of the most insanely gorgeous sprites I've ever seen. Unfortunately, many of the SNK fighters, such as King of Fighters 11, have some pretty terrible filtering on the characters, and look horrendous by today's standards.
Ranger mission.
Heck, there's even a couple of cool light gun games, if you have a CRT that can run at 480p. But if you know my game tastes, it's a given that one Atomus Wave game that I've been dying to play is Dolphin Blue, a side-scrolling run and gun that feels absolutely refreshing in 2021, with the bright blue skies and great-looking sprites. Playing these games on the mode should essentially be seamless if you have the newest firmware, but you might notice some frame rate stutter and slow loading in some games. In this case, create a text file within each game's folder and call it mode.cfg. In that document, type block delay equals 00 on one line and flags equals 7 on the following, and save it. This should essentially remove any sort of locks on the mode and allow it to slightly overclock itself so that it can run these games smoother. I'm told that this won't have any negative effects on the Dreamcast and shouldn't have any on the mode device itself. What an amazing gift to Dreamcast fans, right? Some of these games even have hacks that allow for widescreen support. I can't believe that I'm finally able to play Dolphin Blue after seeing blurry screenshots of it online over 15 years ago. With 3 supported systems under its belt, the mode is a robust and powerful ODE. Seeing that it was designed to support as many systems as possible, it's pretty exciting to think about which systems may be able to use it in the future. Even if the mode is your ODE of choice, or you choose something else, it's so nice to be able to explore some of these game libraries whose prices have become so far out of reach for the majority of their fans. After years of struggling, we're finally at a place where there's plenty of readily available options for everyone.